So good morning, and thank you all for coming. My name's John O'Keefe. I'm a professor of theology here at Creighton, and I also serve as the director of the Center for Catholic Thought and the host of the world-famous Catholic Comments podcast, which some of you may know about. But I'm very, very pleased and honored to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Eileen Burke-Sullivan, this morning. Dr. Burke-Sullivan is a member of the theology department here at Creighton University and the holder of the Barbara Reardon Haney Chair in Pastoral and Liturgical Theology. She's also the director of Creighton's Master of Arts and Ministry program and the associate director of the Master of Christian Spirituality program. Dr. Burke-Sullivan completed her pontifical degrees in the field of ecclesiology at the Weston Jesuit School of Theology, which I also graduated from, which is now also now known as the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. She also has a master's degree in vocal and choral performance from the University of Colorado College of Music and a master's in theology in spirituality from Creighton. Dr. Burke-Sullivan currently teaches both undergraduate and graduate theology courses in Ignatian spirituality, liturgy, sacraments, ministry, and systematic theology. She's a member of the Catholic Theology Society and the American Academy of Religion and the Catholic Theological Society of America. For many years, Dr. Burke-Sullivan served as a full-time pastoral minister in both parish and diocesan positions and offered ministry formation courses, retreats, and spiritual direction for lay men and women and clergy throughout the United States and Canada. She's deeply involved in Jewish Christian dialogue projects and ecumenical dialogue in Dallas, Boston, and Omaha. Dr. Burke-Sullivan has served extensively as a liturgical director and consultant for parishes and dioceses in Wyoming, Nebraska, and New England. With her brother, Kevin Burke of the Society of Jesus, Dr. Burke-Sullivan recently wrote the Ignatian Tradition, which has been published by Liturgical Press. She has also written extensively in pastoral journals, and such as Today's Parish, Pastoral Music, Liturgy, Theology, and Human Development. I would also mention that Dr. Burke-Sullivan is a frequent and popular guest on our podcast, Catholic Comments, which is hosted by myself and Dr. Wendy Wright here at Creighton University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Eileen Burke-Sullivan as she speaks to us on the topic, Fire in the Hearth, Celebrating Liturgical Times.
Thank you, John, and thank you, all of you, for coming and for being here as part of this wonderful program that we have collaborated on. John and Wendy and others have worked with me to develop this legacy celebration these 4 years. When we first started thinking, when I actually first started thinking, shortly after I was installed in the chair, inaugurated in the chair, the pastoral liturgical chair here at Creighton, it occurred to me how quickly the 50th anniversary of Sacrosanctum Concilium's vote and implementation was coming upon us. And so I thought probably the first major project I should undertake is to really do a conference or something scholarly and pastoral that would allow the students and the faculty to be exposed to this wonderful text. Well, as I was working on this, it occurred to me that why simply celebrate the one document, since it's clear that it's one of a whole complex set of texts that are interwoven, that have brought about a common reform, and that would then allow me to raise the question, how is liturgy directly linked to action, especially action for justice, which of course is a primary concern of Creighton University because of our Jesuit Catholic heritage. So it occurred to me that the text that I could work on, if I were going to present, would be somewhat distinct from some of the other presenters who would most likely address the Eucharist, perhaps, and maybe the other sacraments, or the themes, the theological themes of the document, or the themes of the council in terms of reform. But one area of reform that has received little attention, in some ways, at least pastorally is the practice of what we call in the tradition the Liturgy of the Hours, or the Divine Office. It's obviously celebrated in monastic communities, but it's not a well-known part of the Catholic tradition among ordinary lay Catholics, and certainly not among my students. Plus the fact that recognizing the meaning of liturgical time itself and celebrating or engaging liturgical time, which is so profoundly countercultural in the United States, might be well worth our time. So I began thinking through how to do this, and of course, as with any subject field like this, there are hours and hours and hours of scholarship that could go into a presentation. A friend of mine who is a liturgist used to say that he and I we each had one talk, and they were about 15 hours long. And we just picked and chose segments for various events. So I suppose this is a piece of a 15-hour talk. But I wanted to start with the language of Fire in the Hearth, celebrating liturgical time. But why that title? I did my doctoral dissertation on the work of Yves Congar, a French Dominican that Father Baldwin mentioned yesterday as one of the key voices of the council. And I did my study on his work on unity in the Christian tradition and Catholicity. So those two great movements of the Spirit, which in some ways seem almost opposite of each other. And I followed Father Congar's thinking from his early years in the 1930s up to the time of his death in the mid-90s of the last century. And without a doubt, Congar was one of at least 5 of the advisors to the bishops, the specialists called paridi, who had enormous influence on the final documents. He actually had primary writing responsibility for 8 of the 16 documents, and he had a hand in at least 4 others, if not 6 others. So his work greatly influenced the bishops, his theological reflections prior to the council and during the council, his mentoring and his work on committees with the bishops, even though he was something of an outcast by a certain cadre of the episcopacy, because during the 50s he had been silenced by the Universal Church, by the authority of the Vatican. He was a man who was certainly a man of the times. His life in the heart of Europe crossed the whole period of the First World War, the Second World War, and the follow-up to that. He was imprisoned by the Nazis during the Second World War for nearly 6 years, and so he knew solitary confinement, he knew aloneness, he knew being an outcast. He was sent more and more deeply into confinement because he kept trying to escape, and interestingly enough, used the time to learn Russian and to several other languages so that he was able to work with the Russian Orthodox when he came out of this confinement back into Western culture after the war was over. So he's a man who suffered greatly at the hands of the world and then suffered greatly at the hands of the church because his works were essentially condemned and he was silenced and sent into a kind of exile within his own Dominican order for several years. And we might say retrieved from the theological ash heap by John XXIII in 1958, because in 1956, when Pope John XXIII was, 54, when he was the Archbishop of Paris, he had read in French Congar's book on the possibility of reform, true and false reform, which was the book that had gotten Congar in trouble. And John XXIII is reported to have said, "Reform, is it possible?" And as we know, it not only is possible, but he became a primary agent for that. So Congar, standing here in front of the house where he lived in Paris, I think, was an enormously important influence on the work of the council, including the Constitution on the Liturgy, although there his work was more indirect because it was actually more accepted in the draft that had been written. But nonetheless, he had a deep sense of the church as the presence of Christ in the world. This was central to Congar's thinking. And he wrote a passage at a point where he was almost at his lowest ebb, having been silenced by the leadership of the church and prohibited even from the use of libraries so that he could pursue his scholarship. He wrote a short passage on the church as the hearth of his soul. He says, the church has been and is the hearth of my soul, the mother of my spiritual being. She offers me the possibility of living with the saints, and when did she ever prevent me from leading a Christian life? In the midst of doubts and tempests, the church is always worthy of the grace that dwells in her, and in the host of witnesses of which the Epistle to the Hebrews speaks. Thanks to her memory and to her consciousness of self, which are her living tradition. Congar was fully and utterly convinced that the Spirit of God, the third person of the Trinity, actively dwells in the church. And he also believed profoundly in the fact that the church is the body of Christ. As you read the full corpus of his works, which is huge, you discover that his consciousness of the church as sacrament, using that language, the church itself articulates in time and space the reality of the presence of God for the human community. We begin to see how influential in many of the texts his voice became. Now, he wasn't alone in that thinking. Obviously, he'd drawn it from the fathers of the church. He'd drawn it from the writings of Thomas Aquinas, with whom he was deeply familiar, being a Dominican. And he'd drawn it from the writings of Merler and Dry, both of whom Father Baldeman spoke about yesterday, the 19th century thinkers who were so profoundly committed to retrieving a sense of the Spirit in the church, in the Western church. Ever since the split with the East and the West, in the 11th century, the West had less and less of an active sense of the Spirit's dynamic role in the church. In fact, in one place, Congar asserted that the living or dynamic presence of the Spirit was confined to the real presence of the Blessed Sacrament, the Blessed Mother, and the Pope, the infallibility of the Pope, and that it wasn't to be discovered in the West in a lot of other places. Although he counteracts that in another study, but he was profoundly interested in restoring a deep sense of the presence of the Spirit and of the truth, the biblical truth, that the ecclesia is the sacramental articulation of the body of Christ in historical time. So in the world right now, if we want to most profoundly encounter God, at least from the Catholic Christian perspective, that most profound contact comes in being in contact with the Catholic tradition, with the Catholic Church, as the articulator of that when it's at its best. Obviously, and Congar did a lot of writing on this, that the Church institutionally periodically wanders away from being its true self. He sometimes talks about Mother Church being an old hag. So he had some very vivid images of the church having a problematic sense. But despite all of that, he was deeply clear in his own thinking that the church was his mother. I was fascinated recently when Pope Francis was talking about the integral relationship between Mary and the church, that they're signs of each other in a very interesting way. And I happen to agree with him theologically very strongly in that area. But he talks about sometimes, Francis retrieved the notion of our mother, the church, being a prostitute. And yes, indeed, when we cease to listen to the Spirit who is the lifeblood of the church, we cease to experience the will of God, then we cease to be church. Even if we're institutional, we are not practicing what we preach. So I'm going to pose this morning that liturgy is the fire in that hearth. Now you might leap to say, well, wait a minute, isn't the Holy Spirit the fire in the hearth? And I'd like to say yes, but I think that the Spirit is unleashed in and on the church continually through its liturgical activity. That's the primary means. Now, it's not the only means. The church itself says that, but it's the primary means. And that liturgy sources all the rest of the Christian life when liturgy is rightly understood, and then collects it all and brings it to perfection. So liturgical prayer is the source of our faith. It's through baptism, a liturgical action, that we are empowered in faith and hope. It is the source, in a very real way, for our personal prayer. It's the source of any apostolate that we might have, any call to serve as apostles, any ministry, any mission. It is the source of our community because it is the liturgy that discloses the spirit of unity among us. And it is the source of all works of justice and of mercy. So the liturgy gathers all this together and brings it to fruition in our lives when the liturgy is rightly understood and rightly celebrated. The Constitution reasserts this by saying that, first of all, that very interestingly, the first document that was dealt with, they dealt with the aims of the council. Why has this council been called? One of the critical aims is to impart an ever-increasing vigor to the Christian life of the faithful. So in the Constitution on the liturgy is seen the ground for increasing this vigor in the life of faith. And the document also states, the liturgy is the outstanding means whereby the faithful may express in their lives and manifest to others the mystery of Christ and the real nature of the true church. Further, it goes on to say it is through the liturgy, especially, that the faithful are enabled to express in their lives and manifest to others the mystery of Christ and the real nature of the true church. Rightly then, the liturgy is considered as an exercise of the priestly office of Jesus Christ. In the liturgy, the sanctification of the human person is signified by signs perceptible to the senses and is effected in a way which corresponds with each of these signs. In the liturgy, the whole public worship is performed by the mystical body of Jesus Christ, that is, by the head and his members. A number of years ago, when I was a worship director of a diocese, or of an archdiocese that will remain nameless, I had the opportunity to work with a number of churches that were actually undertaking some renovation of their space. So I was working with the pastors, with the parish building committees, the liturgy committees, all kinds of groups, and was doing some fairly basic education in the document, in the Constitution on the liturgy and in the general instruction and so on. And then at that time, the bishops had come out with a first version of how to build churches and so forth, and think about. And one of the interesting things is, as a side effect, you might say, but a necessary side effect of the council's decision or statement or assertion, that it is Christ who celebrates the liturgy, and the whole church, all of the baptized are the Christ, then the whole Christ has to be seen in the worship space as co-celebrators, or concelebrants, I suppose we could say, that in some way the community of believers has to be seen as the primary celebrant. Now, it's a community of believers that has a priest as its head, and as a deacon perhaps proclaiming the gospel, It has other ministers leading certain parts of the liturgy, but all of that together, the primary minister is the assembly, and the primary voice is the body of Christ. How do we make that real in spaces that were designed theologically for a two-tiered church? And that was the problem before the council. The theology that had prevailed for 900 years, since the Gregorian Reform in the 11th century, a theology that had prevailed was that the true church were the clergy, the ordained, and then they pulled the baptized into the church. And the image was often used, for example, of the bark of Peter, where the clergy are the crew that really manage and man the bark, the boat, the ship, and then the crew, the passengers are the baptized, who are sort of in the nave or the belly of the ship. And so even the nave of our churches was the space where the laity sat passively or stood passively for the most part, while all the action was done most of the time by clerical ministers. That got breached in the United States because we didn't have enough clerical ministers, so lay people were drawn in, for example, to music and to assisting in various ways, and they always had to do so on the fringes of the space. So we built lofts and different places where we could hide them because they weren't clerics or destined to be clerics, because God forbid they were women. In any case, this pre-Vatican II church, Catholic Church, had a kind of, well, I would say, twisted theology of ecclesia from the first 1,000 years. And at the heart of the Second Vatican Council, particularly the Constitution on the liturgy, this one we're talking about, there is a return to a focus on the church as the baptized. That becomes the central message in a very real way to that document. So the baptized, the buildings literally had to be reformed in order for worship in post-Vatican II liturgy to be effective, be able to take place. We needed to not have multiple rooms where some people hid out while others were in other rooms. We needed to not have separated space by high steps that indicated status and low places that indicated less status, and so forth. There was one point I did some research on a church following the Council of Trent, the building of a church in Milan, and literally the church was built in such a way, much like a nave of a ship, if you will, where steps were all around the congregational area, so that the priest never had to step down to where the people were at any time. Once one was consecrated into the higher church, one didn't have to move through the lower church. That kind of theology is what was turned on its head, in a sense, by this Constitution. So there really was this kind of radical theological reform. And it was a reform that is still ongoing and that we still haven't fully gotten all the implications from. We haven't begun to kind of pull together, well then how does ministry work? How does leadership function, and so forth and so on. We're still working on all of that. But one of the key things we were doing was literally changing buildings so that the community could see themselves gathered at the table of the Word and at the table of the Eucharist as equal tables. That was a big shock to people too. And as I was doing these workshops, I would often talk about, don't diminish your sense of the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Obviously, that's extraordinary. There's no question about it. But elevate your sense of the presence of Christ in the Word. Stop thinking of the Word as just any words and start experiencing it as Christ actually speaking to us through the Word. And in several dioceses, I got in a bit of trouble with that because it made priests a little nervous that I was somehow diminishing the Eucharist. And I thought, how interesting that says to the person who thinks that it's diminishing the Eucharist, because they obviously have to have a diminished sense of the Word to see that the comparison or the equivalence as diminishing to the Eucharist. In any case, this one church where I was working, I happened to be asked to do a whole series of talks for the ministries. So this parish was somewhat advanced. This is the late 70s. So they had lectors, they had Eucharistic ministers, they had musicians, they had a whole kind of panoply, you might say, of post-Vatican II lay ministries for liturgy that had begun to emerge in the parish. And I drew the short straw to speak to the ushers, the ministry of ushers, which arose in the early days from the porter ministry. But ushers in the early 70s were notoriously, even late 70s, were notoriously those Catholics who were kind of on the fringe of the liturgy. They liked being at the front door because they could slip in and out. They were the guys who liked to slip out for a smoke during the homily. Or they were the guys who liked to sit in the back and read the bulletin sometimes. They were guys that liked people oftentimes, but they didn't want women to join them in this ministry. This was a guy thing. So I braved all kinds of terrors and presented myself to this group of 55 ushers to talk to them about why the building was being changed, and fairly radically changed, and how it would be arranged, or be flexible about arrangement, and how they would continue to serve in it, but it would be slightly different. But I was working with them to try and get the basic theory down. What is this essential theory? That the whole church, who is Christ, the living presence of Christ in the world, the whole church is the celebrant of this liturgy. We have a presider, we have other assisting ministers, but the assembly, in a very real sense, is the whole church is celebrating. And one of the treasured artifacts, artistic artifacts in this building, was a giant crucifix. I mean, I think it was 16 feet tall, and the corpus on it was proportional. So it was enormous. And it had hung in the back, above the altar, above the high altar. But in the renovation of the space, that back space was going to be a Eucharistic ministry chapel, a Eucharistic tabernacle, the tabernacle and the place for reservation and prayer. And in front was going to be a space for the whole assembly to worship that wasn't articulated by high steps and so on. And there would be a psychological divider between the two, not so much a physical one. Although it was enough of a physical one to cause people heart attacks. But in any case, the cross was going to be hung on that divider. And we were talking about these different signs and so forth, and I was comforting them that their very, very favorite crucifix was going to be available to them as a primary symbol that was going to be there, but not as a primary symbol, but as an important symbol. The primary symbols, I kept trying to stress, would be the table, the altar table, the table of the word, the ambo, the chair of the presider, and then the chairs, the pews or chairs of the assembly. Anyway, these guys were sitting there. Body language told me everything. They were about as resistant to the words that were coming out of my mouth as you could possibly imagine. Crossed legs, crossed arms, tilted back a little bit, almost to a person, and frowns. And I was trying to cajole them into thinking, this very inspiring thought. Finally, after almost 40 minutes or 45 minutes of this presentation, I'm thinking, I'm winding down, folks. You're sapping all my energy out of me. And so I completed, and I said, so are there questions or comments? So this fairly substantial man stood up, and he says, yes, I have a question. He says, now I've been listening to what you had to say. And he says, I think that you said that I should see Christ more in these guys sitting around me than in that crucifix right there. I said, yes. Actually, that's exactly, you got it. That's precisely what I've been saying. That we should be seeing Christ in one another. Well, he says as he crosses his arms, I can't and I won't. So much for my success as a public speaker at that point. I was stunned. I mean, what do you say at that point? Not a lot. So I said, well, so that's where we are. And we kind of quietly, and it was like Jesus saying, let the one that threw the stone, the one without sin throw the stone, and they all kind of creep away. They all sort of crept away. These guys all kind of quietly got up and got their jackets, and nobody talked. They just kind of quietly left. And finally, one man came back to me, and he said, that was a very hard saying tonight. That was very hard. But he said, something in me says I got to think about it. That's the truth that I have to hear. Because I'm not ready to say that yet. So what strikes me is much about the Reform has many layers of tradition, of experience, of understanding, of catechesis and so forth, many layers to penetrate. But I think that that's been our labor, and it continues to be our labor in trying to make sense out of all of this. So I wanted to turn finally and really spend the last few minutes that I have on the topic that I had hoped to really get to, but everything I've said up to this point applies. Because this area of liturgy is one of the ones that's least understood and least integrated into our thinking. Time itself as liturgical symbol and therefore agent of transformation. You recall a few slides back, I quoted the text where it says that the liturgy is mediated in symbols that are appropriate to the particular message. And the agency or medium, if you will, the symbolic medium for the liturgy of time, the liturgy of the hours, is time itself. It's the giving over of human time for the purpose of nothing more than the praise of God. When we have celebrated Liturgy of Hours in parishes, which, by the way, affects the day and the week and the month and the year in our thinking, when we've celebrated that, people will say things like, well, what good does it do for others? We're coming and we spend this 15 to 25 or 30 minutes singing or praying, saying prayers, psalms, but we could be giving that 30 minutes to serving the poor. The answer is, of course, you could be, or you could be giving the 30 minutes to playing games on your computer. But what do I get from it? I mean, I get something at Mass, don't I? I get communion. And in the sacrament of baptism, I get baptized, or I get my baby baptized. I can get confirmed. I can get married. What do I get from the liturgy of time? And isn't this then a waste of time? Or why bother? First of all, I think that the approach to liturgy as a consumer mentality is utterly destructive of all liturgical life. The Constitution insists that the liturgical life is an engagement in the paschal mystery of Christ. It is a realization of the paschal mystery. The paschal mystery comes into our story, or we come into the story of the paschal mystery by engaging liturgy. It forms us into the personhood of Christ in the paschal and through the agency of the paschal mystery. Which means, if we take it seriously, the paschal mystery means claiming our humanness, that we are not God. First and foremost, we are creatures. We are not God, and therefore we are subordinate to God's desires. So to enter the paschal mystery means to claim being human as not in charge, not in control, not in possession, even of my own life. Secondly, entry into the Paschal mystery really requires that I submit, therefore, since I'm not God, submit my ordinary human life to the discernment of God's desire for me. In some way or another, that I engage with God so that I discover the best ways that I can flourish as a human person. If God is my creator and my source, if I engage with God, I will be what God desires, and therefore what will make me happiest. I think of Jesus in the desert with the temptations. The temptations for human persons are to be our own God, of course, but to not do things God's way. Well, okay, we'll do what God wants, but we don't want to do them God's way. And these are constant risks, so that the requirement, if you will, of entering the Paschal mystery is that we subordinate our hopes and dreams to a prayerful reflection on what God's hopes and dreams are for us, because it is in those hopes and dreams of God that our flourishing will take place. Our greatest happiness is found. Finally, the Paschal mystery requires us that we embrace the fact that as humans we will die. And so we let go of our lives in a very real way. I don't know if you saw the movie about the brothers, the monks in North Africa a few years ago, that they were martyred, the Algerian martyrs. Trappist monks. And in the film, which was rather beautifully done, there's a place where the doctor, the brother that's a doctor, says to one of the younger monks, the younger monk says, "I'm afraid I'm going to die. I'm afraid that the rebels are going to kill us." And he said, "But brother, you said yes to dying when you made your vows. This is just finishing what you already agreed to." In fact, he could have said, theologically more accurately, you said yes to dying when you entered baptism. When you entered the Paschal mystery, you agreed to take on your humanness, which will end in death. Furthermore, if you take on the Paschal mystery, you enter death not only for your own sake, but for the life of the world. You lay down your life in order to take it up again, but in order to save the broken world. So the Paschal mystery, to enter the Paschal mystery with Christ, to be Christ in the world, engages us in a process of transformation into Christ and then of servanthood for the world, even unto death. And that's the nature of the Christian life. That's the true nature of the church. So the liturgy facilitates that, makes it possible, supports it, nurtures it, and does the transformative work. In fact, if we think of the Eucharist as the model, the enactment there of we encounter Christ in the community as it gathers, we discover ourselves more truly as communal, as children of God, in union with all of our brothers and sisters. We're shaped in the Word into the mind of Christ. Paul told us to put on the mind of Christ, and we're shaped by the Word to that mind. And then we're called to be transfigured by laying down our daily life in the form of bread and wine. All the sacraments call us to lay down some dimension of our lives in death. Every liturgical act involves a personal death. It's sacrificial as well as sacramental. That is, in the sacrifice that we lay down and take back up the Christ life, the world knows God more completely. So as we look then at the question of, it's easier to see with the sacraments. It's, I think, relatively easy to see with the way we celebrate the Eucharist, particularly in the Reformed rites. But it's not so easy to see in the Liturgy of the Hours. This is time spent doing nothing but praising God and hearing the Word and then speaking the Word in the psalmody, iterating the Word out of ourselves. And so the Liturgy of the Hours forms us, interestingly enough, by asking for our submission of time, daily time, weekly time, monthly time, yearly time, to the Christian mystery, pondering it, allowing it to shape us and to shape our attitudes and values. If we think of the structure of the office, the divine office of the Liturgy of the Hours, we sanctify the times of the day by praising God in the morning, by stopping our work, whatever it is, at some point in the midday. There are actually 3 options, and monastics usually do all 3. But for the rest of us, a short version of simply pondering at midday, in the middle of our labor, that our day belongs to God. And then evening as the sun is setting, repenting of the ways that we were not perfectly present, praying for those who are suffering or dying, and asking for support for the morrow. And then a night prayer that does invite us to an examen, and then an office of meditation or of pondering word as a way of shaping our consciousness. Any of those pieces are liturgical acts. Any one of them is a liturgical act, and therefore no one of them is ever done privately. They're always corporate acts. They're always community acts. Even if I pray them personally, that is, in my own room or whatever, I'm united with the whole church praying this way. We also sanctify time through the way the office is structured by recognizing the week, Sunday as the day of the resurrection, Friday as the day of the death of the Lord, and our recognition of death. Saturday is a day of rest, if you will, in the tomb, a kind of reflection, and Thursday is a day to be grateful for the food that we have been fed, Eucharistic food particularly. Wednesday is a day of social action in a very real sense, of doing penance on behalf of the world, in solidarity with the world, and so forth, so that this project, if you will, of sanctifying time is very articulated down to every week. We have this little kind of mini experience. Well, first of all, each day we have a kind of mini experience of the Paschal Mystery through the day. Then each week expands it a little bit. And then we have the whole yearly cycle, which of course invites us to ponder the mystery in a sort of bigger way through cultural and personal exercises during the season of Lent and Easter, during the season of Advent and Christmas, and so on. The Liturgy of the Hours selects the psalmody and the readings to invite us more deeply into that transformation. But we have to ask the question, how is this sacramental? How is this sacrificial? And how is this a memorial? It seems to me. It's sacramental because when the community gathers, and that's the ideal way for doing the Liturgy of the Hours, when the community gathers, we recognize Christ in the community's gathering. It is sacrificial in that we have to sacrifice our time. And I don't know about you, but time for a university professor is almost the hardest thing in the world to give up. It is incredibly demanding. And yet to take and literally give time to nothing but praising God with brothers and sisters in song, in prayer, in thought, to do that meaningfully solely for the purpose of being in solidarity with the brothers and sisters and with Christ himself in order to tell God how wonderful God is. That attitude, that capacity transforms us over time. And it is a memorial because Jesus himself sought the wisdom of God in prayer in his own life, so that we remember him in the sense of being with his life. We walk with him in this form. Now, one of the great complaints at Creighton for doing the Liturgy of the Hours in any kind of a regular way is that we're a Jesuit school, a Jesuit Catholic university, and Jesuits don't do Liturgy of the Hours in community. Why should we try something like that at Creighton? Liturgy of the Hours seems monastic, monkish, rather than apostolic. We have a more important apostolate, I hear from some of my colleagues, than singing the hours or praying the hours. We do whatever rather than, serve the poor, visit the sick, and so on. I'd like to suggest that the principle and foundation of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius begins that the human person is created for the praise and glory of God, and that it is our sole purpose for our existence. The first principle of the Christian life, the foundation of the Christian life that Ignatius recognized, is that we have to recognize that we are not God, but God is, and God is to be praised. That we would sacrifice our time for that purpose will transform us into a human in the mode of Jesus' humanity. Famous voice who sort of brought this notion strongly, besides the fact that Ignatius requested that the Jesuits wouldn't have to celebrate the hours in a monastic form. And that was an historical moment when monastics celebrated the hours. It was very time-consuming, yes, more than just a half an hour, and it required great musical training and so forth and so on. It was practical. It was practical for the society not to undertake sung hours in their ministry. He says, Nadal wrote to Charles Borromeo, the cardinal that the Pope had asked to investigate whether or not the Jesuits should be required or continue to be required to sing the hours, as other religious communities did. Nadal wrote, "Then also, since we have so many difficult and necessary occupations, mind you, lest souls be lost for whom Jesus Christ was crucified and died, we judge that certain rituals are not proper for us, since they can impede our ministries, just as certain things are suitable for other religious orders and other things are not." So it would impede our ministries. So the question we have to raise is, if we're going to restore the Liturgy of the Hours in a practical way, at least the hinge hours, which the Church insists are the most important, morning and evening prayer, or some occasional evening prayer, we'd have to have a good reason tied into our apostolate as, in a very real sense, missionaries for the poor and educators for the uneducated, I guess. So why would we bother engaging in this? I'd like to suggest, and I'll end my reflections with this, that the Liturgy of the Hours, when rightly done, is remarkably transfigurative because it's steady and over time. It's a constant renewal over time. Sunday after Sunday, or morning after morning, or Wednesday after Wednesday. It's whenever it happens on a regular basis that we catch a deeper insight into the Paschal Mystery and into the life of a Christian, the human life of a Christian. First of all, though, this liturgical prayer can be celebrated as liturgy with entirely lay leadership. The liturgical act of proclaiming the Liturgy of the Hours does not, and has not for centuries, required clerics. Monastic communities with no clerics, women's communities with no clerics, have celebrated the hours. Lay people can and do lead this prayer meaningfully, and the whole community prays it meaningfully, hopefully. One way to educate in an institution like this, leaders for prayer for their future parishes, is to practice this on a regular basis. It involves the whole person and invites the whole person, a little cara personalis here, to community of beauty, of prayer, of quiet, and I would add of transformation. The Psalms, which are the content, if you will, of the Liturgy of the Hours, form the mind of Christ in those who proclaim them over and over, and they feed the Spirit with God's Spirit. The sacrifice of time shapes our consciousness that we are not God, and that's profoundly countercultural. It unites us to the whole church, in a way that is at once expansive and intimate. When we've celebrated the Liturgy of the Hours here at St. John's, I might add for almost 30 years on Sunday evenings in the parish, students have told me when they have come, usually bribed to be there with extra credit, but nonetheless, they get there. They have told me over and over again, gosh, this is so intimate. This feels so, I feel so supported in this prayer. This is different from any time I've ever celebrated. Are you sure this is Catholic? It's profoundly ecumenical. It allows Christians to pray liturgically without the issues of intercommunion. And this is another one of the values. Many of our Christian brothers and sisters celebrate ours in some form in their own traditions. So this is a place where Christians can and do. And I would just call to our attention Taizé, which is internationally famous for the fact that there is a crossroads where people from all denominations meet and all nationalities meet and pray together the Liturgy of the Hours. That's precisely the medium of that community that is so intensely bonded, even though at their soul, you might say, they're still divided by the denominational differences. So they're bonded into the Spirit of Christ. The unity of Christ's Spirit works around our ideological and denominational differences. For all of these reasons, and finally I'd like to suggest, I think the Liturgy of the Hours feeds the spirit of those who really do want to do justice, because it prepares us first to be servants in Christ's servanthood. When we lay down our time to praise God, God embeds in us a capacity to serve others that is reserved to the Christ. We're allowed to heal, to reveal, to disclose the good news. For those in families that are divided in many respects, the Liturgy of the Hours as prayer is a structure that allows them to pray without, worrying about what comes next. It's a structured, formed prayer. And as such, as a formal prayer, it forms our hearts. But it allows enough flow within it. And what's kind of fascinating about the Reform is that when the books that came out are still pretty clerical in their address, because obviously the clergy, the ordained clergy, are still required to pray the hours. And what I'm always surprised by is that clergy don't get it, that if they pray it with the congregation, they don't have to pray it privately. I mean, if your community prays it with you, or prays it and you're not able to be there, but they're still praying it on your behalf, then your parish, you might say, is covered. One of the things we need to be attuned to is that for a university, learning to manage time, learning to recognize and honor our humanity, not our divinity, learning to deal with taking care of our own hearts first in order to take care of others, all of those gifts can flow in and out of a constant celebration of the Liturgy of the Hours. I'm grateful to the music department for retrieving the Taizé process, the Taizé prayer, at least monthly, and I would hope that at some point we can restore in the collegial community at least Sunday celebration of Vespers or evening prayer, because it brings a kind of conclusion to the day and a start to the week that is very enriching for those who have participated in it through the years. So let me stop with that. I think there are lots of places we could go. There's lots of hope we could still have. But the reality that I'd like to stress is that liturgy is not nothing. All liturgy is Christ dynamically acting in time and in space and is transformative. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Eileen, for that really thoughtful presentation. And Eileen asked me at dinner last night, which was fairly late, if I would make a few comments in reaction to her talk. So I haven't seen it, so these may just seem a little bit off the cuff. But I'm really struck by the problem of how hard it is for people in this culture to enter into any kind of sacred sense of time. I've been teaching undergraduates here for now, this is my 22nd year, and even to talk about the idea of the sacred is alien to them. And many of them have gone to Catholic schools and gone to Mass their whole life. So there's some way in which the ideal of that we've been talking about here of the liturgy to form us into a real deep religious consciousness, sometimes it just doesn't work. And I'm thinking about, after Charles Taylor, his book, The Secular Age, there's been a growing articulation of this sense that the church needs to focus as a pastoral priority on the resacralization of the world, to get people to see again the sacred dimension of reality. And so that was really running through my head a lot as you were speaking. And certainly architecture matters a lot, and how we design our buildings and our spaces. Last year, I think it was one of the speakers from the conference last year on the podcast actually said that he thought the most lasting impact of Vatican II is going to be architecture in terms of the way it forms people. I can't remember who said it. We're up to like 320 programs now, so maybe somebody listened and heard it. But architecture matters a lot, how we design our buildings, how we configure our spaces, and it's often neglected and not really, people forget how important it is, but really for me, the thing that struck me most is this idea of time and the poverty of time in American experience right now. Since 2007, I've had, I think, 8 or 9 trips to the developing world. And somewhere along the way, somebody said to me, you guys have the watches, but we've got the time. And man, they do have time. And I was in Congo in January and attended a 3-hour-long Zaire Rite liturgy. And the thing, I didn't even notice the time. It was like leaving the earth for a while, and then all of a sudden it was over, and I'm like, oh, that's so sad. I don't want, and nobody seemed to be in any kind of hurry. Americans could never endure a 3-hour liturgy, or at least they think they couldn't. But what is it about our collective way of dealing with time that makes it so hard to enter into that experience? And maybe what we really need to do is have a real intentional religious practice that forces us to try. So those are my thoughts. And thank you again for your wonderful presentation. And we do have some time for questions and discussion. And I will moderate that.
Are there questions that you have? The mic, I think, is in the center, can be turned on, and so if you have some comments, it doesn't have to be questions. Do you have comments or reflections that you'd like to share? We need to take 5 minutes and talk at your tables first. Oh, John's ready to. Okay. Go ahead, John.
I'm so shy, I don't mind getting the ball rolling.
Good, thank you.
Speaking as one Jesuit, let me say I can't agree with you more about the necessity of daily prayer. It's very difficult, I think. I've worried about this, puzzled about this as a Jesuit liturgist for years, how difficult it is for us to get together. I mean, there's something about Jesuit culture in which they say Jesuits are a group of radical individualists working at cross purposes for the greater glory of God. So, and sometimes it seems like there's some truth to it. I'm also reminded of the comment made by my colleague, Father Robert Taft, who says, St. Ignatius, and I think you were talking about this when you quoted Nadal, St. Ignatius wanted his confreres to be out in the streets, working 4 and 5 extra hours a day that would have been taken up by the office, not so that they could have a half hour extra for cocktails in the evening. So, right. I think one of the problems is our mono-Eucharistitis. Maybe you could address this. Okay. I use a medical term, even though I know there's a medical person here. Mono-Eucharistitis, overinflation of the Eucharist. I mean, the Eucharist is the center of our lives, et cetera, et cetera. It's extremely important. Great part of the reform was recovering the centrality of the Eucharist, but I think somewhat to the loss of certainly to the loss of devotions, But devotions we've begun to realize are nothing compared to the Church's real daily prayer, the prayer of the hours. So, and I think it also goes to some of the things you said about the clerical aspect of some sacramental practice as opposed to the hours. So maybe you could comment on that a little.
I am inclined to agree with you that there is a huge overemphasis. Not that the Eucharist obviously isn't central and obviously isn't important. It is. So I want to assert that in no uncertain terms. And the Eucharist draws all other liturgical prayer to itself in a way. I mean, all other liturgical prayer kind of shapes us and forms us toward the Eucharist. But one of the problems is that we have turned the Eucharist into something we can use. So we have fathers say Mass for the basketball team, or, say Mass for a rain or whatever, and don't even think about the fact that first of all, Mass has its own integrity. The Eucharist has its own intentionality and its own integrity. And when it's only celebrated once a week for the vast majority of Catholics, it's very hard. We overload it with too much demand, and then its own purposes don't shine through. But all liturgical prayer has this transformative or transfigurative character to it, and I think we're afraid of that too. I think we've taken the consecrated elements and made those the fullest and only expression. It's something like what Congar was complaining about in the Middle Ages, that the Spirit's presence has been locked into the bread and the wine, if you will, or the bread, because the wine isn't even reserved. And so the reserved sacrament of the Eucharist becomes the only sign of Christ in the world, rather than a means to feed and nourish the larger living sign of Christ in the world, which is the church, the community of believers. I was reading this a few years ago, and I went and looked for it again a couple of weeks ago, a book by Father Kilmartin that was collaborated with Father Taft. These are two major liturgists of the last 50 years, I'd say. Anyway, Kilmartin makes an interesting point that if we really pay attention to the Eucharist or to all liturgical prayer, the liturgical prayer has a purpose, it's purposive toward transforming the church into Christ. So that the ultimate real presence at the end of any liturgy, but specifically at the end of the Eucharist, is the community that walks out. The body of believers who are the walking, real presence of Christ in the world. And we don't carry the book out because the Word, was a means for forming us into the mind of Christ. We don't carry the Eucharist out because the Eucharist is a means for nurturing us and feeding us into the fullness of our Christ Spirit. If we got that, and I think really got it, and then could apply it to the other sacraments. I do this with my sacraments class. The students are probably ready to gag over this, but we talk about this all the time, that there's this dynamic within every sacramental act of transformation. So the function of marriage is to transform a married couple into a manifestation of Christ in the way they're married. The sacrament of the sick is to manifest the presence of Christ, both in those who are ill and in the healing capacity of the church, and so forth and so on, all those things we've been talking about. In the Liturgy of the Hours, there's a really important sense that the agent symbol of time is itself transformative if it is committed into the mind and heart of God and given back to us to use for the sake of the kingdom. In other words, the agency of the sacramentality, the symbol, the agent, is the mediation, if you will, for the community of believers to be transformed into Christ. And what is transformed is our human lives. So it's our time that is offered up. And God takes our time and transforms it into his time for us. He transforms it into kairos. So our chronological minutes and hours and days become the Lord's time. The period of reality that is that, if you will, nexus point between this creation and the new creation. You know, and that's all poetic and it's theoretical unless we can see it practically occurring, that a human person over time is transformed into seeing his or her time as gift of God to be used for the sake of the kingdom. And that's ordinary Christians, not just those who are vowed or ordained. But all of us, if we could give our time, that would solve the problem, John. I hear what you're saying, that there is this huge problem with time in the United States. We don't understand that time doesn't belong to us. Time is not ours. And yet, we have a certain sense of the use of time, and so we sacrifice that use of time in order to receive it back to be more fruitful with the time that we're given. Yeah, it's just a way of thinking about it. Does that respond to your question, John, or to your comments? You really hit, I think, at the heart of a lot of the issues. I think the clerical problem, the fact that this is a liturgical prayer, and it isn't clergy alone who are nervous about this. I think the laity are panic-stricken by this. I remember a number of years ago I was wearing an alb and leading a community in Advent in Liturgy of the Hours, and this woman came up to me afterwards and she said, "You have no business acting like a priest." I said, "But I do, because I am a priest. I'm a baptized member of the priestly people. I share in the priesthood of Jesus Christ, as do you. And in that, I can pray. In fact, I'm compelled to pray always. That's the primary ministry of the church in a very real sense. So how do we do that more? I think, again, we go back to this question of how are we going to be more true to our Catholic Jesuit mission? Well, nothing would be more Catholic than helping us shape our sense of time into God's gift to us for the service of the kingdom of God. Long answer to a short question. Robert.
Well, thank you, Eileen. I think that was wonderful. Your chair has an adjective, pastoral, and so I'd like to ask you some practical questions about how you make some of these things work. As we all know, the document itself calls for pastors of souls to celebrate the hours in parishes, right, and at least on Sundays. And that has not been picked up, as you know, to any appreciable extent. There has, in fact, been a certain amount of lay initiative in that regard. I travel a lot, as you know, and so I drop into churches in various places, and I've discovered lay groups doing scheduled vespers in the evenings in a downtown Chicago church and in a downtown San Francisco church, etc. But they're the exceptions, and they wither after a while because they're dependent on a single person, and something happens and other things, and there isn't anybody there to pick it up anymore. On the other hand, parish priests are loaded with so many responsibilities, and they're running these huge parishes with school systems and all the other things that drain their energy and consume their attention. Have you given thought to how we can institutionalize the hours in a parish in such a way that they take ownership, at which point you can have a group of people who would be willing to preside and lead, etc. And so it doesn't become dependent upon a single person who gets sick and nothing can happen that night because he or she wasn't available anymore. It's these practical aspects that I'm concerned about. What thoughts have you in this regard?
Well, actually, I've done a fair amount of thinking about that very problem because it is, there is a sense that if you commit to this to a community, then you are pretty bound to be there pretty regularly. And is there a possibility that you'd be out of town or that you'd be sick or something, whoever is kind of thing. So it becomes imperative that there be group leadership and some kind of clarity that, this would be, even priests, now this is less true today because there are fewer priests, but in the days in the past when you had multiple priests or several priests, they shared the responsibility of leadership, of assembly, and of various things. So There are lay leaders, there are diaconal ministers, there are lots of folks, I think, who could be brought on board. The critical thing is if you're going to try and sing hours, you need somebody who has some singing skills. And if you don't want to sing them, I mean, if you can't, and recite them, that can be very fruitful too. But it is richer if it's sung. It's more satisfying, I think, aesthetically, and otherwise it brings a kind of a richer sense of prayer. But finding a way to share that out across a group of leaders who then would take some responsibility to pull in others. First of all, there's a catechetical project that has to be done because in the United States, very few lay people really know or understand, is my experience, know or understand the Liturgy of the Hours. And again, it goes back to the thing of, well, how can this be liturgy if it's not led by a priest? Or a deacon. Yeah, that's an issue. It's a big change.
I'm wondering if you could do something at the institution where you might be able to persuade campus ministry to get students to do the hours,
undertake some leadership.
And then they would take that with them when they leave. And it's interesting. I think one of the things we're good at here, really good at, is the whole service and justice, the expression of the faith that does justice. But it might be interesting to recouple that with the contemplative side of the faith that does justice in an intentional way. What do you think about that?
Well, and to me that would be very critical. That was one of the reasons for getting into this in the first place. Justice without prayer becomes social action, sort of secular social action in a way. If justice isn't grounded in a real vision of reality as God, as belonging to God, and of ourselves as agents of God, then we become kind of social do-gooders, and I think it's very easy to burn out. If you do this for humanistic reasons, humans can be very quarrelsome and very difficult to cope with, and after time it's just like, why bother? So there's a sense in which the wisdom of the tradition, the Christian tradition, is so deeply imbued with the fact that we have to be fed by more than mere human support. We have to be, or whatever, we've got to be fed with a real deep sense of God's presence and God's agency, with God's Spirit. And that's the thing that the liturgy at large is meant to do, is to literally immerse the church in the truth of its identity, so that we are empowered from an absolutely endless well of support and energy. Because if we depend on ourselves, we will die. We will dry up and die. If we depend on God, all things are possible. Yes? Yes, go. Okay.
John referenced students. I want to push it one step further and think about staff, and particularly faculty members. Would you think the following thesis makes sense? In addition to the 3 or 4, depending on whether you split service into a clinical service and other forms of service, would it make sense to hold the thesis that one constitutive element of being a Catholic university might well be that liturgy, in the broader sense as you just described it, is an academic mission that one could hold faculty members to as one of the things they have to do. And then related to that, is there a way in which the Liturgy of the Hours could be shaped to be more fitting to the specifics of a university qua university?
Sure. I think both are possible. That would certainly cause some eyebrows to go up if we started proposing it, but I don't know why we shouldn't. I mean, we're dealing with for the greater, so maybe this would be the greater. One of the things that I think that would really be imperative in a university like this, where we have so many from not just Christian tradition, but from other traditions, that if we were going to involve them in some form of prayer that is, that doesn't require them to pray in a tradition that isn't their own, we'd have to figure out a way to do that. It's not as hard to do across Christian traditions, of course, but it might be more difficult if we were going to try and do that, say, in the clinical setting or and so on. But I think that we could put our creative minds and dialogical heads together with others from other traditions and find out. Pope John Paul II found ways to pray with a whole multitude of world religious at Assisi several times, to some scandal, actually, of the rest of the church. But so I think there's some possibilities of how we might do that. And certainly one of the things about Liturgy of the Hours is that is built into it is a sense that this is indeed a fairly flexible form. Now, I have worked with bishops who don't think it's flexible at all. But the truth of the matter is it is a flexible form. It has lots of interpretives. And the lay community through the centuries has found ways to adapt it. When they couldn't read the Psalms, they learned the Rosary. That became the formative methodology of doing the hours of sorts. The Angelus at noon is a kind of replacement for midday prayer of the hours. When people couldn't read and write, they could memorize a short text of Scripture and praise and so forth. So there are some traditions, even within the Catholic tradition, of devotions that are part of, but we're a literate culture now, and a university as the center of a literate culture ought to be able to do the hours meaningfully. I think oftentimes, I was pointing this out with John and Wendy the other day in a podcast, John Henry Newman, now St. John Henry Newman, was famous at Oxford for his short homilies every Sunday afternoon at university vespers. And he had a huge following of students because of his leadership of prayer as an Oxford Don. And that was absolutely inherent in the practice of Oxford University. I don't know if it still is, but that's the kind of thing that perhaps we could look maybe and say, what are the possibilities for retrieving something like that in a way that would make sense in a Catholic university? Thank you. Thank you very much.